The morning started like any other in the quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun was just beginning to peek over the rooftops, casting soft golden light across neatly trimmed lawns and clean sidewalks. Birds chirped in the trees, and the occasional sound of a lawnmower filled the air. The protagonists stepped out onto their porch with a cup of coffee, taking a deep breath, enjoying the peace and quiet of their home. For years they had lived here without trouble, tending to their garden, painting fences, and making sure the house looked welcoming and neat. Everything had been simple and comfortable, but not everyone in the neighborhood was content with simple and comfortable. The Homeowners Association, known to be strict and sometimes overbearing, often made life more complicated than necessary. The HOA president was a woman with a sharp eye for detail and a reputation for enforcing rules without much sympathy. She had a way of making small things feel like major problems, and residents often felt intimidated by her presence. The protagonist had managed to stay out of her path so far, but they knew the woman kept a close watch on everyone's property, ready to pounce at the smallest perceived mistake. That morning, as the protagonist sipped coffee, they noticed an envelope in the mailbox. It had the HOA's logo on it, crisp and official. A sinking feeling hit their chest. They knew what this could mean. Slowly they opened it, careful not to tear the paper. Inside was a letter, formal and direct, pointing out something about their property that allegedly violated HOA rules. It was a minor issue, really, something trivial that didn't bother anyone, like a small garden decoration or a slightly overgrown bush. But the tone of the letter made it feel serious, almost like a threat. The protagonist frowned, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief. They had spent countless hours making their home look nice, following all the HOA's rules as best they could, and yet here was another complaint. They read the letter again, noting the strict language and the demand for immediate correction. The HOA expected obedience without question, and it was clear they had a track record of intimidating homeowners to get compliance. Despite the irritation, the protagonist decided not to let the letter ruin their morning. They stepped back, taking another sip of coffee, and considered their options. They could ignore it and risk escalation, or they could respond calmly and assertively, showing that they knew their rights. The thought of confrontation was uncomfortable, but so was being bullied into compliance. They knew that standing their ground would be necessary. As the day went on, the protagonist tried to focus on normal activities. They watered the garden, swept the driveway, and even mowed the lawn, making sure everything looked presentable. Neighbors waved as they passed by, exchanging casual greetings, completely unaware of the tension building. The protagonist's mind, however, kept returning to the letter and the implications. They wondered if the HOA president might show up at the door in person, something she had been known to do when she felt a homeowner wasn't complying quickly enough. By midday, the protagonist heard the faint sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Looking up, they saw the HOA president stepping out of a sleek vehicle, holding a clipboard and walking with a purposeful stride. Their stomachs sank. The woman's presence was intimidating, even without words. She approached the protagonist's porch, her eyes scanning every detail of the property as if she were measuring it against an invisible checklist. The protagonist greeted her politely, keeping their tone calm and friendly, hoping to avoid immediate conflict. But the HOA president wasted no time. She began pointing out minor issues, raising her voice slightly, her gestures sharp and precise. Every word was designed to assert authority, to make it clear that she expected compliance and respect. The protagonist listened patiently, feeling a mix of annoyance and determination. They knew they were in the real, though the immediate confrontation with the HOA president had ended. The protagonist knew that vigilance was still necessary. Life in the neighborhood had returned to a calmer rhythm, but subtle reminders of the previous tension lingered in their mind. They went about their days tending to the home, maintaining the garden, and performing routine tasks with a sense of calm awareness. Every small action, watering plants, sweeping the driveway, arranging decorations, was a reassurance to themselves that they were in control, that the intimidation of the past days had not diminished their peace. Neighbors continued their routines as well, some exchanging friendly greetings, others quietly observing. The protagonist noticed that the interactions with neighbors had changed subtly. There was a sense of respect and acknowledgement in the way people looked at them. Perhaps a quiet recognition of the composure and strength they had displayed during the HOA confrontations. It was a reminder that confidence and calm can influence not only the situation directly at hand, but also the broader community. Over the next few days, the HOA president made occasional appearances, but these were noticeably different. The air of intimidation that had defined her previous visits was absent. She inspected properties with careful attention, but spoke in a restrained tone, conscious now that the sheriff had set clear boundaries and that the protagonist's composure could not be easily undermined. Each interaction was brief, polite, and carefully monitored, a marked change from the aggressive approaches of the past. The protagonist reflected on these changes and felt a sense of quiet pride. The power dynamic had shifted, and the neighborhood had taken notice. They continued to maintain detailed records of every encounter, understanding the importance of documentation, not as an act of fear, but as a practical measure to ensure clarity and preparedness. Their approach combined firmness with courtesy, showing that respect does not mean submission, and that standing firm can be done without hostility. One afternoon, as the protagonist tended to the garden, a neighbor stopped by and commented on how well everything was maintained. "It's really impressive how calm and composed you've been through all of this," the neighbor said quietly, a tone of genuine admiration in their voice. The protagonist smiled, grateful for the small acknowledgement, and responded, "Thank you. It's been challenging, but staying calm and knowing my rights has made all the difference." The interaction was a reminder that resilience is often recognized more in quiet strength than in loud confrontation. The protagonist understood that the ordeal with the HOA president had not only tested their patience and knowledge, but it also revealed the importance of composure, clarity, and thoughtful action. These qualities had shifted the neighborhood dynamics and demonstrated that intimidation could be met with confidence and lawful support. Over the following week, the protagonist continued to monitor the property, making minor adjustments and keeping documentation up to date. They remained alert, but the tension that had been present before had eased significantly. The HOA president's visits became even less frequent and were conducted with formal politeness, a clear acknowledgement that her previous attempts at coercion were no longer effective. The protagonist also began to reflect on the personal growth that had come from the experience. They realized that facing intimidation and maintaining composure had strengthened their sense of self and confidence. They had learned that preparation, patience, and clear communication were powerful tools, not just for handling conflicts with the HOA, but for navigating challenges in general. The sense of empowerment that came from standing firm in truth and fairness was deeply satisfying. One evening, as the sun set and the neighborhood settled into quiet routine, the protagonist sat on the porch sipping tea and reflecting on the past week. They felt a profound sense of and that this woman was overstepping. Neighbors passing by glanced at the scene, some slowing down to watch. The protagonist noticed their curiosity, but chose to remain composed. They spoke calmly, explaining their perspective, pointing out that the property was in compliance with all HOA rules. The HOA president didn't seem convinced, her eyes narrowing, but the protagonist didn't falter. They had prepared for this possibility, knowing that standing firm was the only way to prevent being bullied. The conversation continued, tense but controlled. The HOA president cited rules, regulations, and previous complaints, trying to create a sense of urgency and pressure. The protagonist responded with facts, politely but firmly, showing that they were knowledgeable about their rights and the rules governing the neighborhood. The woman's frustration became apparent, her confident demeanor cracking slightly under the weight of a homeowner who refused to be intimidated. Minutes passed, feeling much longer than they actually were. The protagonist remained calm, breathing slowly, focusing on maintaining composure. The HOA president finally paused, scanning the property one last time, her expression a mix of irritation and disbelief. It was clear she hadn't expected this resistance, hadn't anticipated a homeowner who would calmly stand their ground. After a tense silence, the HOA president finally left, muttering under her breath about follow-ups and fines. The protagonist watched her go, feeling a sense of relief, but knowing the situation wasn't over. The woman had a history of returning, sometimes with more aggressive tactics. The protagonist cleaned up the porch again, rearranged a few decorations, and tried to return to a sense of normalcy. But their mind kept replaying the encounter, analyzing every detail. By evening, the protagonist sat on the porch again, sipping tea, reflecting on the day. They realized that standing up calmly and confidently had been empowering. They had not allowed fear to dictate their actions, and they had maintained control of the situation. Yet, a small part of them remained wary. The HOA president had the power to escalate matters, and the protagonist needed to be prepared. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, the protagonist felt a mixture of exhaustion and quiet pride. They had faced intimidation head-on, navigated a tense confrontation, and emerged intact. The quiet neighborhood seemed peaceful once more, but the tension lingered in the back of their mind. They knew that tomorrow could bring new challenges, and that the HOA president might return. Testing their resolve once again, the protagonist resolved to stay vigilant, documenting everything, understanding the rules thoroughly, and preparing for any further encounters. They also reminded themselves that standing up for one's rights didn't require aggression, only calm confidence and clarity. The day had been a test of patience and courage, and they had passed. Yet they knew the story wasn't finished. The HOA president's presence loomed like a shadow, and the next move would determine who truly held power in this quiet suburban street. The next morning, the protagonist woke early, feeling a mixture of anticipation and unease. After yesterday's confrontation, they knew it was likely the HOA president would return, possibly more determined than before. The sunlight poured into the kitchen, and the protagonist made coffee, trying to steady their nerves. The streets were quiet as usual, but there was a tension in the air that made the neighborhood feel different. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bark, seemed amplified. They moved about their morning routine with deliberate calm, aware that today might be another test of patience and resolve. By mid-morning, subtle sound of a car approaching caught their attention. Looking up, the protagonist saw the HOA president driving slowly past the house, then turning into the driveway with a sense of purpose. The sleek car stopped, and she stepped out again, clipboard in hand, her expression sharp and calculating. The protagonist's stomach tightened, but they forced themselves to remain calm. They knew any hint of fear or hesitation could give her the upper hand. Instead, they stepped out onto the porch, hands visible and voice steady, greeting her in a neutral tone. The HOA president wasted no time. She started immediately, pointing out minor details with exaggerated precision, almost as if she were measuring every inch of the lawn and garden with invisible tools. She raised her voice slightly, enough to assert dominance without being openly hostile. Her gestures were quick and purposeful, signaling authority. The protagonist listened, nodding occasionally, taking mental notes of each complaint. Inside, they were calculating how best to respond without escalating the situation. Knowing that calmness could be more powerful than confrontation, "You really need to trim this bush," she said sharply, pointing to a small shrub near the driveway. "In this garden decoration, it doesn't comply with the regulations. I expect it removed immediately." The protagonist took a deep breath. "I understand your concern, but this decoration and the bush are both within the guidelines outlined in the HOA rules. I've checked thoroughly, and everything here complies." Ack. The HOA president's eyes narrowed. She leaned slightly closer, emphasizing her words. "That may be your interpretation, but it's not acceptable to me. I expect corrections now." Neighbors walking past slowed down, glancing curiously at the exchange. Some whispered to each other, noticing the tension. The protagonist was aware of their attention but refused to let it distract them. They spoke clearly, calmly, making eye contact with the HOA president. "I've read the regulations carefully. I'm following the rules as written. If there's a specific clause you believe I'm violating, I'd appreciate you pointing it out." The HOA president's face showed a flicker of surprise, quickly replaced by irritation. She wasn't used to residents questioning her authority so directly, especially in public view. She shuffled papers on her clipboard, muttering about citations and fines, trying to regain control. The protagonist stood their ground, maintaining calm, knowing that the key was to not let her intimidation succeed. Minutes stretched like hours. The HOA president's voice grew sharper, her tone more insistent. She attempted to pressure the protagonist, suggesting that failure to comply immediately would result in escalating fines and further scrutiny. The protagonist responded methodically, calmly explaining that they were prepared to defend their position legally if necessary. Each statement was made with clear, measured confidence. Designed to show that they were informed and not easily manipulated, the tension was palpable. The HOA president gestured toward the street as if preparing to call someone or involve authorities. The protagonist's heart pounded, but they didn't flinch. They knew that remaining composed was crucial. They continued to speak firmly, but politely, emphasizing that they wanted to resolve the matter peacefully and within the rules. But that intimidation would not change the facts. The HOA president's frustration became more visible. Her carefully maintained calm gave way to subtle signs of agitation, tapping the clipboard, shifting weight from one foot to another, and speaking in clipped sentences. The protagonist noticed these changes, understanding that patience and clear reasoning were having an effect. They didn't need to escalate. The situation was already leaning in their favor because they refused to react emotionally at one point. The HOA president took a step closer, lowering her voice, but speaking with sharp intensity. "You may think you know the rules, but I am responsible for enforcing them. You cannot ignore my authority." The protagonist held their ground, voice steady. "I respect your role, but authority doesn't override the rules themselves. I am within my rights here, and I would appreciate a cooperative approach rather than intimidation." A brief silence followed, the kind that feels weighted and stretched. The HOA president scanned the property once more, as if seeking a minor flaw she could exploit. She found nothing significant. The protagonist's careful attention to detail and preparation had paid off, making it impossible for her to cite any real violation. Neighbors started to murmur, some nodding subtly in support. The HOA president noticed the small signs of solidarity and seemed momentarily disarmed. The presence of witnesses often changes the dynamics of confrontation, and this was no exception. The protagonist's calmness and clarity, combined with the subtle observation of the neighbors, made the situation increasingly uncomfortable for her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the HOA president stepped back, muttering under her breath about rules and follow-ups. Her attempts at intimidation had failed. The protagonist remained composed, quietly observing her departure, ready to document every detail if necessary. They felt a mix of relief and cautious pride. Knowing that they had maintained their dignity while asserting their rights, the protagonist returned inside, taking a deep breath and reflecting on the encounter. They knew that this wasn't over. The HOA president had a history of persistence. It was possible she would try again, perhaps using different tactics. The protagonist began to consider strategies for the future, thinking about documenting compliance, keeping a record of interactions, and maintaining calm under pressure. As the day continued, the protagonist went about normal tasks. Though their mind occasionally returned to the confrontation, they watered the garden again, trimmed minor edges, rearranged decorations slightly, not because they had to, but because it gave them a sense of control. The neighborhood, in its usual quiet rhythm, provided some comfort, but there was an undercurrent of tension. The protagonist knew the next move could happen at any moment. By evening, the protagonist reflected on the events. They felt a growing sense of empowerment. Standing calmly in the face of aggression was not easy, but it was effective. They had learned that composure, knowledge of rules, and polite firmness could neutralize even the most intimidating behavior. Yet they also recognized the potential for further escalation. The HOA president had a tendency to push boundaries, and the protagonist needed to be ready for anything. The night fell quietly, the streetlights casting soft pools of light across the driveways. The protagonist sat on the porch drinking tea and listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood. They felt a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and readiness. Today had been a confrontation, but it had been handled with poise and clarity. Tomorrow might bring new challenges, but the protagonist was determined to face them with the same calm resolve, knowing that standing firm in truth and fairness was the strongest position they could take. The following morning brought quiet tension that the protagonist could almost feel in the air. After 2 days of minor confrontations and warnings, it was clear that the HOA president was not going to give up easily. The protagonist had prepared themselves mentally, making a list of points, rules, and evidence to defend their property, but they also knew that today might be the day when the situation escalated. The calm neighborhood felt deceptive. Everything looked peaceful, yet under that surface, storm was brewing. By mid-morning, a familiar sound announced the arrival of the HOA president. Her car rolled slowly into the driveway, deliberately timed as if to assert presence and authority. The protagonist stepped onto the porch, ready to meet her with the same calm and polite demeanor as before. Inside, however, their pulse quickened. They had learned from previous encounters that her tactics could be unpredictable, and preparation was key. The HOA president stepped out, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning every corner of the property. Her expression was sharper than ever, reflecting both irritation and determination. The protagonist greeted her politely, keeping their voice even and steady, but the tension between them was palpable. The woman didn't respond to the greeting. Instead, she began immediately, pointing out minor issues with exaggerated urgency. "You really need to do something about that bush? And this decoration, it's completely against the rules. I will not tolerate this any longer." The protagonist maintained calm, speaking clearly. "I've reviewed the guidelines thoroughly, and both the bush and the decoration are within the rules. I am happy to discuss any specific clause you believe is being violated." The HOA president's eyes narrowed. She was frustrated that her authority was being questioned again, and she tried a different approach. She leaned closer, lowering her voice, but speaking with intensity. "You may think you know the rules, but I enforce them, and you will comply. If you do not, fines and citations will follow immediately." The protagonist took a deep breath, resisting the urge to react emotionally. "I respect your role, but enforcement must be within the law and the actual rules. Threats and intimidation do not replace facts." The woman's face flushed slightly, and her hands gripped the clipboard tighter. She began pacing the property, pointing at various elements, listing rules, some of which seemed arbitrary. The protagonist listened carefully, not interrupting, documenting each statement mentally. They knew that this calm attentiveness would make it clear who was in control of the situation. As the confrontation dragged on, neighbors began to take notice. A few slowed down as they walked by, glancing curiously at the heated exchange. Some whispered to each other, noting how the protagonist remained composed while the HOA president seemed agitated. The subtle presence of witnesses shifted the balance slightly, adding an unspoken pressure on the president. The HOA president's tactics escalated. She raised her voice, demanding immediate action, citing fines, and suggesting that the homeowner would face serious consequences. The protagonist responded methodically, explaining that they had complied with all written rules and that any fines or citations issued unfairly could be challenged. They spoke with a firm politeness, projecting calm confidence that contrasted sharply with the president's growing agitation. The president tried one final tactic. She suggested involving law enforcement to reinforce her authority. She implied that a police officer might be needed to ensure compliance. The protagonist, however, did not react with panic. They continued to speak clearly and confidently, stating that they welcomed any lawful review and that they were ready to show proof of compliance at any time. This unshakable calm started to visibly unsettle the HOA president. The tension reached its peak when the HOA president made a sudden move, stepping closer as if to assert dominance physically. The protagonist did not flinch. They held eye contact, standing their ground, calm and deliberate. The body language alone communicated that they would not be intimidated. The president paused, realizing that aggressive gestures were ineffective, and that escalation would not succeed in this moment. After a long pause, during which neither spoke, The HOA president took a step back, muttering under her breath about follow-ups and inspections. She was visibly frustrated, and her attempts at intimidation had failed once more. The protagonist maintained a calm expression, noting the subtle shift in the president's demeanor. This encounter, while tense, had shown that composure and clarity were more powerful than threats. As the HOA president finally left, muttering about rules and regulations, the protagonist felt a cautious sense of relief. They had managed to stand firm, resisting the pressure to act hastily or out of fear. They watched the car disappear down the street, aware that this was only a temporary reprieve. The president might return with different tactics, but for now, the protagonist had proven that intimidation could be met with calm strength. Inside the house, the protagonist reflected on the day. They realized that the key to navigating such confrontations was preparation, knowledge, and maintaining emotional control. They reviewed the rules again, ensuring that their understanding was precise, and considered what strategies might be needed if the HOA president escalated further. Documentation and calm communication were their strongest tools. The afternoon passed quietly. The protagonist engaged in routine chores such as cleaning, gardening, and organizing documents, all while keeping an ear out for any sign of the president's return. The calm of the neighborhood seemed almost surreal after the intensity of the morning. The protagonist understood that the contrast between peace and tension was part of what made these encounters so stressful and draining. As evening approached, the protagonist sat on the porch, reflecting on the day's events. They felt a sense of empowerment, having faced repeated attempts at intimidation without succumbing. Yet, they also felt a growing awareness that the situation could escalate further and that they needed to be ready. The calm demeanor they had maintained was not just a personal victory, but also a demonstration that knowledge and composure could counteract aggression effectively. Night fell quietly. The street bathed in soft light from the lampposts. The protagonist took a deep breath, sipping tea, thinking ahead. They knew that the HOA president's persistence could lead to further attempts, possibly involving outside authority or legal measures. But they also knew that they were prepared, both mentally and practically, to face whatever came next. Standing firm, documenting interactions, maintaining calm would continue to be their strategy. The protagonist felt a quiet pride. They had navigated confrontation, pressure, and intimidation with clarity and patience. The tension in the neighborhood was still present, but it no longer felt overwhelming. They had taken control of the situation not through aggression, but through composed assertiveness. The night grew darker, the quiet suburban street resting under a calm sky. Yet the protagonist remained alert, ready for the next challenge. Confident in their ability to meet it with strength and poise, the morning was cool and quiet. The kind of morning where the air feels heavier with anticipation, and the protagonist could sense that something important was about to happen. After several tense days dealing with the HOA president's intimidation, they were both alert and cautious. Every sound, every movement outside seemed to carry weight. The calm streets of the neighborhood belied the tension that had been building for days. The protagonists moved about their routine carefully, making sure the house was in order, documents were organized, and any potential areas of dispute were noted and ready to defend. By mid-morning, the sound of a car arriving drew their attention. The protagonist looked up, expecting almost instinctively the familiar figure of the HOA president. But this time, something was different. Alongside the sleek car of the HOA, a second vehicle had pulled up, a sheriff's patrol car, unmistakable with its markings and authoritative presence. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat, not with fear, but with a sense of relief. They had hoped that law enforcement might intervene if the HOA president's tactics escalated too far. And now the moment had arrived. The HOA president stepped out of her car first. Clipboard in hand, her face a mixture of irritation and determination. But her usual confidence faltered slightly as the sheriff stepped out of the patrol car, tall, calm, and authoritative. The sheriff's presence immediately changed the atmosphere, giving a sense of order and impartiality that the protagonist had been hoping for. Neighbors who had been watching from a distance paused, sensing that this confrontation was about to reach a turning point. The sheriff approached the protagonist first, nodding politely. "I received a report of a possible dispute involving the HOA," the officer said in a calm, steady voice. "I'm here to understand what's going on and ensure that everything is handled properly." The protagonist felt a wave of relief. "Thank you, officer," they said. "The HOA president has been making repeated threats and accusations about minor matters that comply fully with the rules. I've tried to handle it calmly, but the intimidation has continued." The sheriff nodded, listening carefully. "I'll need to speak with both parties and review any documentation you have. It's important that we ensure the law is being followed and that no one is being unfairly threatened or intimidated." The HOA president shifted uncomfortably, clearly surprised by the presence of law enforcement. Her attempts to assert authority seemed diminished under the sheriff's calm observation. The protagonist handed over copies of the HOA rules, past letters, and any documentation of previous interactions. Showing a clear and thorough record of compliance, the sheriff reviewed the materials, nodding occasionally, and then turned to the HOA president. "I've reviewed the rules and the homeowners' records. It's clear that they have been complying with the guidelines as written. While enforcement of rules is your responsibility, intimidation and threats are not acceptable. Any further attempts to pressure or coerce them could lead to legal consequences." The HOA president's face went pale. She had not anticipated such a firm, impartial presence. Her usual tactics of raising her voice, gesturing aggressively, and implying authority were rendered ineffective. The sheriff's words were calm, but carried undeniable weight, and for the first time, she was confronted with the reality that her overbearing behavior had limits. The protagonist watched the exchange silently, feeling a sense of vindication. They had maintained composure throughout the entire ordeal, and now that patience and clarity were recognized by an authority figure, the tension shifted dramatically. The sheriff continued to speak, explaining the proper way to handle disputes, the legal boundaries for the HOA, and the importance of fairness and respect. Neighbors had gathered at a safe distance, quietly observing the situation. The protagonist noticed subtle nods of approval and whispered comments of support. The HOA president, usually confident in her ability to command attention and compliance, appeared increasingly frustrated and flustered. The presence of the sheriff, the clear documentation of compliance, and the calm demeanor of the homeowner combined to undermine her previous attempts at intimidation completely. The sheriff turned to the protagonist again. "You have every right to maintain your property as long as it follows the HOA rules. Any attempt to intimidate you or coerce you into compliance beyond what the rules require is unacceptable. If further issues arise, document them and contact law enforcement immediately. We will ensure that your rights are protected." The HOA president tried to speak, attempting to assert some authority, but the sheriff's calm and steady presence left little room for argument. Each word she tried to use to intimidate was met with polite but firm correction, reinforcing the limits of her authority. The homeowner observed quietly, their earlier anxiety replaced with a growing sense of empowerment. The tension that had been mounting for days began to dissipate as the HOA president realized she had no leverage. After a few more minutes, the sheriff concluded the discussion, reminding both parties to remain professional and adhere strictly to the rules. The officer's tone made it clear that intimidation or harassment would not be tolerated. The HOA president, her face now showing embarrassment and frustration, finally stepped back, muttering about follow-ups and citations. Though it was clear that further attempts to intimidate would be ineffective, the sheriff gave a final nod to the protagonist. "Stay calm, stay organized, and document everything. You've handled this well so far. Your composure has made a real difference." That the officer returned to the patrol car, leaving a palpable sense of order and relief in the air as the cars drove away. The protagonist stood on the porch, letting the relief wash over them. The neighborhood seemed quieter, almost peaceful, but now it felt different, safer, more secure. They reflected on the events, realizing that patience, preparation, and calm had been their strongest tools. The sheriff's presence had validated their approach and shown the HOA president that intimidation was not the path to compliance. Neighbors returned to their routines, some offering quiet smiles and nods of support. The protagonist returned inside, organizing documents and making notes of the day's events. They felt empowered, having faced repeated intimidation without losing composure, and having an authority figure acknowledge the fairness and clarity of their position. As the evening settled in, the protagonist sat on the porch, sipping tea and reflecting on the events. They knew the HOA president might still be present in the neighborhood, but the power dynamic had shifted. Calm confidence, clear documentation, and lawful support had turned to tense, threatening situation into one of validation and control. The neighborhood, bathed in soft twilight, seemed to carry a new sense of balance. The protagonist felt ready for whatever came next, knowing that standing firm with clarity, patience, and respect was the most powerful response to intimidation. The morning after the sheriff's visit felt different. The air seemed lighter and the neighborhood looked the same, yet the protagonist felt a sense of relief and empowerment they hadn't experienced in days. They moved about their morning routine with a calmness that came from knowing they had faced repeated intimidation and come through unshaken. The sun shone on trimmed lawns and quiet streets, and birds chirped as if nothing had happened, but for the protagonist, everything had changed. The power dynamic that had dominated the past few days had shifted, leaving them with a newfound confidence. As the day progressed, the protagonist continued to tend to the house and garden, performing routine tasks with deliberate attention. They watered plants, pruned shrubs, and swept the driveway, ensuring everything was orderly and well-maintained. The actions were not just for appearance, but for a sense of control and reassurance. Each careful movement was a quiet declaration that their home and life were under their own stewardship. The HOA president's previous intimidation felt distant now, almost surreal. As the protagonist focused on practical and meaningful tasks, neighbors passed by throughout the day, some offering quiet smiles and nods, their subtle gestures carrying encouragement. The protagonist appreciated these small connections, feeling supported in a way that the previous days of tension had almost overshadowed. These glimpses of human warmth reminded them that strength and resilience are often reinforced by community, even in subtle ways. They reflected on how maintaining composure, knowledge, and respect had transformed the situation and influenced how others perceived it. By mid-morning, the HOA president appeared again, her car slowly pulling into the driveway. The protagonist observed silently from the porch, ready but unshaken. The previous encounters had taught them patience and the importance of not reacting impulsively. This time, the HOA president approached with an air of caution, noticeably less confident than before. Her gestures were restrained, her voice calmer, yet there was an underlying tension. She clearly understood that her usual tactics were no longer effective. The HOA president spoke, attempting to assert authority, but her words lacked the previous force. "I'm here to ensure everything is in order," she said, her tone more neutral. The protagonist nodded politely, replying calmly, "Everything is in order and within the rules. If there are concerns, I am happy to discuss them respectfully." This interaction, so different from previous confrontations, highlighted the shift in the dynamic. The protagonist remained composed, speaking with clarity and maintaining eye contact, while the HOA president had to navigate her own hesitation and frustration. The sheriff's involvement had changed the stakes, reinforcing the homeowner's rights and establishing limits on acceptable behavior. Over the course of the day, the HOA president lingered briefly, inspecting certain areas and making minor remarks. But she no longer attempted intimidation or aggressive gestures. The protagonists continued their tasks, responding politely and calmly when necessary, demonstrating that firmness, combined with respect, was more effective than confrontation. The neighborhood, meanwhile, seemed to settle back into a quiet rhythm, the tension of recent days gradually fading. As afternoon approached, the protagonist reflected on the journey of the past week. They considered the lessons learned: patience, preparation, clear communication, and calmness under pressure. Each encounter with the HOA president had been a test, and each time composure had been the key to maintaining control. The involvement of the sheriff had underscored the importance of understanding one's rights and knowing when to seek support from proper authorities. The protagonist realized that these strategies were not just about managing one person's behavior, but about preserving dignity and stability in their life. Later in the evening, as the sun began to set, the protagonist sat on the porch with a cup of tea. Observing the quiet neighborhood, they felt a sense of accomplishment and relief, knowing that the ordeal had concluded peacefully and effectively. The HOA president, though still present in the neighborhood, had learned that intimidation was not a viable tactic. The protagonist had maintained their composure, documented every interaction, and allowed the proper authorities to intervene, resulting in a fair and balanced resolution. Neighbors walked by, some stopping briefly to exchange words. A few complimented the garden or noted the orderly appearance of the property. The protagonist smiled, appreciating the human connection and support that had been subtly present throughout the ordeal. It was a reminder that standing firm with respect and clarity not only protects one's rights, but can also foster a quiet respect among the community. As night fell, the protagonist prepared for rest, reflecting on the experience with a sense of calm empowerment. They understood that challenges might arise in the future, but the principles that had guided them, knowledge, patience, composure, and respect, would continue to serve them well. The neighborhood was quiet and peaceful. The protagonist felt a renewed sense of ownership over their life and property. In the days that followed, life returned to normal, with the protagonist tending to the home, enjoying the neighborhood, and interacting with neighbors. The tension of the past days had transformed into a story of resilience and empowerment. The HOA president, aware that her attempts at intimidation had failed and that further aggression could lead to consequences, maintained a cautious distance. The protagonist had proven, through calm, measured actions and a clear understanding of their rights, that they were not to be bullied. Looking back on the experience, the protagonist realized that the journey had been as much about personal growth as it was about defending property. They had learned to trust their judgment, to remain calm under pressure, and to navigate conflict with integrity. The sheriff's involvement had reinforced the importance of lawful intervention when necessary, and the support, however subtle, from neighbors had shown that community awareness can be quietly powerful by the end of the week. The neighborhood had settled into its usual quiet rhythm. The protagonist felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not only in having successfully managed the confrontation, but in having maintained composure, dignity, and respect throughout. Their home remained a place of peace, and their confidence in handling challenges had grown stronger. The story of the HOA president's failed intimidation became a quiet testament to the power of calm, knowledge, and persistence as they sat on the porch one evening. Watching the sunset paint the sky in soft colors, the protagonist reflected on the lessons learned. Challenges, no matter how intimidating, could be met with clarity and calm. Knowledge of one's rights, preparation, and patience were tools that allowed them to navigate conflict effectively. And most importantly, standing firm with integrity could transform fear and intimidation into a demonstration of strength and resilience. The neighborhood remained peaceful, the air calm, and the protagonist felt a quiet pride in having met the challenge and emerged stronger, wiser, and empowered.